Welcome to Eyes on Books. I'm so glad you could join us today, and I think you'll enjoy our discussion. We're going to be talking about Fiona Davis's novel, The Lions of Fifth Avenue. My co-host and I will describe the story and tell you a little bit about it, and then after that, we'll actually be able to interview Fiona Davis and ask her some of our questions. It's actually a split story. There's part of the story that occurs in 1913 and the other story, 1993. The two women in the stories are Laura, 1913, and Sadie, 1993. The title of the book refers to the lions in the front of the New York City Public Library. And the library is the backdrop for the story. So we'll continue now telling you a little bit about Laura and about Sadie.
Interesting, the book again covers an 80-year span, is that it actually mirrors the advancement of women's rights over that time. We actually lived through. Most of our mothers were home with their kids, and our wives and our daughters had jobs. But you could see in this, Laura, back in 1913, she had to struggle with the differences of what's expected of her and what she wanted to do. And then Sadie was in a position of authority where she actually was selected over a male to do a specific job. So times have changed over those years.
Now, the other character in the book was the library itself. What an interesting story it had to tell. The library opened in 1911. It took 9 years to build it at a cost of $90 million. It was actually the largest marble building in the United States at that time. It's said that the day it opened, 50,000 people visited. My co-host and I were questioning that a little while ago. How could that many people go through this building in one day? But historically, apparently, that's what they're saying. The building itself played a very big role in both Laura's life and Sadie's life.
The building itself is marvelous. I come from New York. I've been in that building many times, but never appreciated all that was about that. This book describes a lot of that library, which is magnificent.
Interesting thing about it is that the stacks in the library are so numerous. If they were stretched out end to end, they would actually cover 80 miles. 3.5 million books, plus everything else.
Yeah, that's the size of that thing is immense, and you can't go in and take out a book. It's not a lending library. Mm-hmm. You go in and you do research. You could request a book, and somehow in those 3.5 million books, somebody goes and finds the book you request, and they deliver it to you. It's a very interesting library, but it's been there now for over 100 years.
The other interesting thing I thought, in addition to books, this particular collection, the bird collection, which Mike mentioned, contained other things such as artifacts belonging to writers, which I thought was something you might not know existed in a library.
Yeah, they had like canes of famous authors, and it's amazing the value of the paraphernalia that they're exhibiting is why that they had to do so much preparation to show this, to make this show, which was the one of the things that the book was about. Revolves around two women, 80 years apart. One woman who is living in the library with her husband, who happens to be the chief curator of the library, and her family. And there was actually a apartment in the library itself where they lived. And then 80 years later, we have Sadie, who is who works for the library, and we see the differences of how women lived their lives in the early 1900s and in the late 1990s. And the book demonstrates it fairly clearly.
Yes, Laura in particular in 1913 struggles quite a bit because in order for women to actually be mothers, wives, and have a career was nearly impossible considering the restraints of society at that time. She happened to be a very bright girl. She actually went to Vassar College at age 16, had a degree, but wanted more. She applied to the Columbia School of Journalism, and lo and behold, she was accepted.
Trials and tribulations dealing with that school and the way they treated women in the when they first opened, which is would not be accepted today. They actually they wouldn't show them. They're supposed to be journalists, but they couldn't cover any real stories other than little family stories because they were women.
Yes, and the interesting thing is there were 28 students in this class. It was only the second year that the Columbia School of Journalism had been operating. And of the 28, there were only 4 women. And Sadie, or Laura, was one of those 4. And Mike is right. They were given assignments that were supposedly more feminine. For instance, one of the first assignments they were sent out for, the men were sent to City Hall to get stories on current events, whereas the women were sent to a women's hotel where they were going to do a story on what was called the butter ban. Someone decided the cook should not use butter anymore in her meals, and there was an uproar. So the 4 women got to cover that, which was a little different from City Hall.
Switching to Sadie, who 80 years later, she's trying to run some type of presentation of the Berg collection, which is a very intricate and valuable collection that the library maintains. And she's selected to do it over a man, which 80 years before she wouldn't have even been in the library, and now she's in charge of a major effort by that library. And the book basically shows that, where originally Laura had to go through her marriage and deal with her marriage and her motherhood responsibilities, and Sadie didn't like her husband, got divorced. So one of them stayed with her husband, one of them divorced her husband, but that's how life was over those 2 different decades.
In addition to the stories of Laura and Sadie and the library, of course, there was a bit of crime mystery involved in both of these women's lives, and it had to do with book thefts. And it was a problem in 1913 and also again in 1993, and I would think probably during the intervening years there were thefts.
Yeah, this is fictional history, but there are thefts. There were major thefts in New York City libraries over those years, and Fiona includes that as the mystery that keeps this book going, back and forth between the two generations and these 2 women who both are encountering the results of or the ramifications of these thefts.
So I think we've just about given our viewers enough information to get them interested in reading the book, don't you think so?
Yeah, it was a very enjoyable book, and she kept it flowing for the entire book.
Yes, yes.
Now, we will be back with our author, Fiona Davis, to ask her questions about this book.
Yes. Well, welcome, Fiona. We're so glad to have you here with us today. Our listeners are anxious to meet you and to learn more about your book, The Lions of Fifth Avenue. So my co-host, Mike, and I are going to be asking you a few questions, if that's okay.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me on. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
My question is about New York City. It's such a treasure trove of landmark buildings. I was just wondering, how did you first become interested in writing about them? And what a great idea for all of your books.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I kind of stumbled into it. I've lived in New York for about 35 years, and I've always loved old buildings. And when I was a kid, we would go back to England, where my parents are from, and we'd always tour, ruins and castles. So I think there was an inherent love of crumbling buildings way back then. And then, I had an idea. I was a journalist, and I wanted to write an article about the Barbizon Hotel for Women, which had this very storied history. But it wouldn't work as an interview because a lot of the people didn't want to be interviewed. And I started thinking, well, maybe I could write a book about it. And then you get to make things up.
Yeah, which is better.
And so that's what I ended up doing is, yeah, exactly. And yes, that hotel is so many interesting people lived there and kind of grew up there that it was just a perfect place to start.
Yeah.
Yeah, we really enjoyed the history of moving between the two women from the 1913 to 1993. But back in 1913, you talked about the trials and tribulations of Laura with the Columbia School of Journalism. Did you find out that they were that prejudiced? There was that type low approval rating or success of graduating in those years, or that's just something we added to the book?
No, whenever I'm writing a book, I do a ton of research about the time period and what was going on back then. And I found this wonderful book about the history of Columbia University's journalism school, which, just started in 1914 or 1913. And, what was interesting was just how difficult it was for a woman then. First of all, it was amazing that it was co-ed. But, only about 15% of the class were women. And they were set on different tracks than the men. So the men got to cover murders and politics, and the women had to go cover orphanages and charitable organizations. And, I went back and took a look at that book again. And in the first class, there were 28 total students and only 10 graduated. And of that, only 2 were women. So it was a tough program and you could get cut at any moment. So I kind of stayed true to what it was actually like back then. Now, luckily, things have changed today. And, whereas Columbia University, the J School was 15% women in 1913-14, today it's 75% women. So things have certainly changed.
I gather during your research, you came up with that heterodoxy club. Living through the 50s and 60s where women's liberation seemed to start for us, that seemed very unusual to have a club like that back so far.
That's what always surprises me about, going through and researching historical time periods is how these things happen in cycles. And so exactly right. I always thought, the kind of women's movement started in the 60s. But in fact, in the 1910s in Greenwich Village, there was this very powerful group called the Heterodoxy Club, which actually existed. And it was a meeting place for women to really debate the issues of the day, like the right to vote or birth control, or even things like free love, which again, we associate with the 60s. And I read about it in a book about the history of Greenwich Village, and then found a wonderful book on it by Judith Schwartz that's all about the history of the Heterodoxy Club. And I think that's one of the things that's come out as such a surprise from this book, is everybody realizing, wow, women were really, really working hard and making their voices heard back then.
Yeah, that was just a surprise to everyone.
Yeah, it was. Yes, it was. I belong to an organization called the American Association of University Women, AAUW, and that organization also began I think it was in the 1880s. So there were women grouping together way back when, women who mostly were educated but didn't really have a way to get into the workforce. And they were bonding together and sharing information and having speakers and interesting things for them.
Absolutely. And the women's suffrage movement, of course, started
Yes.
in the 1800s. So there was a lot going on.
Yes, yes, certainly. Yeah. I was going to ask you about your character development. I felt that Laura and Sadie were so well developed and so real. I was wondering, did you model them after women you actually knew, or did you just invent them? Either way, you did a great job.
Thank you. Yeah, they're purely invented. I knew I wanted a character who lived in the library, who was the wife to the superintendent, who was kind of wanting to do more, to be more than what a typical woman was in 1913, 14. So she not only wanted a family, she wanted a career. And then Sadie in the 1990s, is this curator of rare books. And what I liked about both of them is that they're both out of step with their time. Mm-hmm. So Laura in the 1910s is really ahead of her time in terms of wanting a career. And then you have Sadie in the 1990s who lives in the past, right? She works with rare books.
Yeah,
she wears vintage clothes.
In the old
her advice
clothes, yeah.
manual is from the 1800s. Yeah. And so it was fun. It gives you kind of an inherent tension when you're working with characters like that. And they really developed from there.
And I think your timing also historically was so good. And I think the fact that you wrote the 1913 portion was before the 1918 flu and before the First World War really got going. And then the 1993 was a time of transition. And I remember at that time, there were some people who actually had home computers. There were people who had cell phones, but it wasn't common yet. It was still limited to some extent. So I think your timing on both of those eras was really good because you kind of got in before things changed.
Thank you. Yeah, and what's interesting about when you're trying to plot a mystery, and I love a page turner. I love a book where you're trying to find out what happened. It's easier when there's no cell phones, if there's missed connections, that kind of thing. It makes it so much easier to create a plot that works, as opposed to, someone calling and saying, hey, I'm running late. Those misconnections, I think, are kind of interesting in terms of moving the story forward.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I actually come from New York. I lived in New York. You could probably tell from my accent. But I worked in the Grace Building right across from Bryant Park, and with a beautiful view of the park. But I would have never guessed that there were book stacks underneath. When did they build those book stacks under the park?
Yeah, so the stacks under Bryant Park were built in the 1980s, and it's 2 levels, and it's enormous. There's a lot of space down there, and they did it because they knew they needed more room. And so there's stacks of books. There's the trolley system to get things, back up into the library proper. But it's this vast underground bunker in a way that you'd never know if you were, walking along Bryant Park on the grassy lawn.
Right, it's a beautiful park, and you'd never imagine that all that was underneath. The beauty of the library itself, I was in there a few times. I got some information. A 4-bedroom, 7-room apartment was in it. It's just amazing. It must have been amazing for you to discover that when you were researching it.
Yeah, that was the main surprise for me as I started researching the library as a possible place to set a story, was finding this New York Times article about the retirement of the library superintendent, who had lived in this 7-room apartment deep inside the library for 30 years, ever since it opened, with his wife and his 3 children. And it talked about how his daughter was born in the library.
Wow.
And how the kids they raised pigeons on the roof. Wow. And that they used to play baseball using books as bases until they got caught. And I just thought, a family living in a library, that's fantastic. And that's when I knew I had a story.
Oh, definitely. That's for sure. Yeah. You wrote a lot about Laura struggling in 1913, 14 to have it all as a mother and a wife and a career woman. I was just wondering what you thought about today and what's happening with women today who are mothers and wives and also career women. How do you think that situation has changed, or is it still a struggle?
You know, I don't have kids, so I it's hard for me to address that. However, I do think for women in careers, it's still tough. You're still not being paid equally. You know, and in terms of childcare, I think it's so hard to be a working mom if you don't have affordable childcare. And so, you know, my hope is things will improve for women where there's other countries where it's so much easier to be a wife and mom and have a career. And I hope at some point the US will start to emulate that, because I think that can only be win-win for everybody.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, you depicted it clearly that here we are with Laura, who has to put up with trying to have a career while she's handling her husband and what's expected of her as a mother, and then come into the 1990s and she didn't like her husband, she divorced him.
I like to really show how things have changed or how they've stayed the same. And so women, you know, in the 1990s definitely did have more freedom. And what cost does that come at? You know, neither woman is happy. And so they're trying to figure out, you know, what they want out of life and how to get it. And that's the fun of writing, is exploring, you know, those ideas and what goes on in real women's minds all the time.
Well, we sure enjoyed reading it, and we certainly enjoyed discussing it for our audience before you came on. And we were wondering if you could tell us something about your new book that's coming out.
Sure. Thank you for asking. The next book is called The Magnolia Palace, and it comes out January 25th, and it's set at the Frick Collection. And the Frick is a kind of a lesser known New York City landmark, but it's a beautiful old mansion where Henry Clay Frick lived with his wife and grown daughter. And it takes place in two time periods again, 1919 and then 1966. And it jumps back in time. There's there's kind of a scavenger hunt, there's clues, there's a big mystery, there's a missing pink diamond. And it's a mix of fact and fiction. So it's taking some things that really did happen and then, you know, adding in characters and things just to make it a book that's a really fun read. And I can't wait to get it out in the world.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
Yeah, the Frick is not as well known as a lot of other museums, but I've been there a number of times. It's a marvelous place.
Yeah, I've been there also. Yeah.
Good. You made my day. It's I agree. It's just a gem of a building in New York City, and has such a wonderful history. And there's so many interesting hidden rooms to explore, which is what I get to do when I write books.
And not to give any secrets away, but are you looking at another building now for your next book?
Yeah, you know, books get published so far ahead of time that I tend to finish it, and then there's about 6 to 8 months before it gets published.
Oh, okay.
Just because there's a long lead time. So I am working on a new book that is actually set at Radio City Music Hall.
Oh, really?
Oh, nice.
Oh, how wonderful.
Yeah.
And that can have a lot of stories.
Oh, yeah. And I've been interviewing Rockettes who were Rockettes in the 1950s, which has been really, really fun.
Oh, wow. That's wonderful. Oh, congratulations for doing that. We can all relate to that. We've been there, right?
Make your research a little harder during the pandemic time. You couldn't interview people. You couldn't go around to buildings.
Yeah, you know, it was tough. And I was working on the Frick book right around then. And I was able to get a behind the scenes tour in January. And then, of course, everything went in lockdown. And luckily, they have an amazing website at frick.org where they have a virtual floor plan. So I could go into any room and look around, get a 360-degree view, which helps so much as I was researching. And thank goodness that really saved the day. Because normally, you're right, I go back and visit multiple times.
Yeah. Wow. That's terrific.
And this Zoom process has really helped a lot also during this process, that we can have this conversation with you without.
Yes, yes, yes.
Oh, I agree. It's such a great way to meet readers who are across the country who otherwise, I would have never been able to meet. So it's really kind of revolutionized the whole book industry.
Well, we appreciate you doing it. We really do. And it's nice to meet you in person.
It was
so to
wonderful
speak.
meeting you, and I really did enjoy the book, and we're looking forward to the next new one.
Yeah.
We'd like to thank Fiona Davis for joining us this morning, and we would like to invite all of you to join us again next month on Eyes on Books, when we will be interviewing another prominent author.
Welcome to the Frick Collection here at 1 East 70th Street in New York City. As some of you know, as part of a renovation and expansion project over the next few years, we plan to open to the public the second floor of the museum for the first time in its history. Since this family home became a museum in 1935, this grand staircase has led to the museum's offices. We've made this short video to tell you a little bit about the history of the second floor. So come with me. Climbing these steps, it's tempting to imagine what it would have been like to have been a guest of the Frick family starting in 1914, when they first moved in. Dinner would have been in the dining room, downstairs on the ground floor, surrounded by British portraits, which was very fashionable in America at the time. After dinner, perhaps a digestif in the Fragonard room or the living hall, also downstairs on the ground floor. And if one were lucky, maybe staying the night, coming up these steps to arrive at the second floor. But don't worry, if stairs aren't your thing, there are elevators too, among the earliest installed in a New York City residence. Past the chimney piece is the main hallway. There were guest rooms on this side, and up above, a ceiling painting of decorative motifs imitating Chinese subjects. It evokes domestic decoration in 18th century France and was made for the Frick mansion by the American artist John Alden Twachtman. Now let's go into what was Mr. Frick's bedroom, which we call the Walnut Room because of the sumptuous paneling. This is where Frick died in 1919, having enjoyed only about 5 years in his dream home. He did have a great view, in any case, of Central Park across the street. Mrs. Frick's bedroom was on one side, and their daughter Helen's room was on the other side. This used to be Mrs. Frick's boudoir, and it used to be decorated with 18th century French paintings from the workshop of François Boucher.
Thank you for the great questions. Those were great questions. It's nice getting questions that I haven't gotten before, so I appreciate it.